Hey guys, welcome back. So, first things first, if you're coming over from TikTok, welcome. Um, like I always explain, I like to just post little introduction videos onto my TikTok account. I don't want to go into the full story um, on TikTok, mainly because obviously they're only short form videos. Now, um, to everyone who has subbed and watching weekly, I do apologise for the lack of content last week. Just a few prior engagements. I just didn't really get around to getting the time to do a video, but I wanted to get one out today because Friday is our day that we spend together. Now, if you have come over and you stumbled across this video and you haven't subscribed yet, please think about hitting that subscribe button. I never ask you guys for money, but a subscription is always free. Um, excuse me. If you like this content, please feel free to like and share it. Please leave a comment if there's anything that you want to add to it. I always read your comments, and please feel free, guys. With all that said and done, we're going to get into tonight's story. So, a lot of us of a certain age will remember the film The Silence of the Lambs and also the book, maybe. Um, and so this story is about the inspiration behind the character of Buffalo Bill. So tonight we're going to be talking about a man called Gary Heidnik. So Michael Heidnik, he was born on November 22nd, 1945, and that was in Eastlake, Ohio. And this was to his parents, Michael and Ellen Heidnik. And he also grew up with a younger brother called Terry. Now, initially, everything was fine in the Heidnik household until about 1964. And this is when Ellen and Michael, they divorced. And initially, Ellen, she had sole custody of her boys. She raised them within a single parent family until about 1968, and they were placed into the care of Michael and his second wife. Now, Gary claimed that at the time of his father was incredibly abusive. He said that particularly his father was subjected to emotional abuse. He himself, Gary, he suffered from chronic bedwetting. He said that his dad would force him to hang the soiled sheets out the window in a way to embarrass him, so the neighbours would see what he's done, and in a way for Michael to humiliate his son. Now, Michael himself, later down the line, when Gary was arrested for the crimes that we're going to get into, he denied all of this. He said that basically it's simply not true. Now, while he was at school, Gary, he didn't really gel with the other students. He struggled to make eye contact. And on one occasion, a particularly new student, she just simply asked him about that evening's homework. And Gary reportedly yelled at her, saying that she basically wasn't worthy of talking to him. He was badly bullied by the other students for particularly having a bizarrely shaped head, according to them. And he claimed that this mishap and shape in his head, this was after an accident after falling out of a tree. And despite these struggles, Gary got really good grades at school. He was tested with having an IQ of 148. Michael encouraged him to enroll at the Staunton Military Academy, and this was in Staunton, Virginia. Gary would have been about aged 14, 15 at the time. He enrolls in his for about 2 years, but he goes back to his school for graduation. He then rejoins the army age 17, and he serves for another 13 months. And his drill sergeant, they graded him as excellent. He went on to apply for several specialist positions. One of these was in the military police, and the military police basically they went on to reject him further down the line. So Gary, he was then sent to San Antonio, Texas, and this was to train as a medic. And he did really, really well at this at the beginning. And he was transferred to a hospital in West Germany, and he went on to earn a GED. And in August 1962, Gary, he began complaining of severe headaches. He began complaining of dizziness, blurred visions, nausea. He was diagnosed with gastroenteritis, and he was prescribed particular medications to help with this. If you guys are not aware of what gastroenteritis is, it's like a severe form of food poisoning. I've had it once, the most chronic pain I've ever been in. I wasn't too sure what it was, so I ended up going to the hospital, having to have an x-ray and staying overnight. It's incredibly debilitating. Now, in October of that year, he was transferred to a hospital in Pennsylvania, and he was diagnosed as schizoid personality disorder. And this was when he was honourably discharged from the military service. Now, not long after the discharge, Gary goes on to become a licensed practical nurse, and this was at the University of Pennsylvania. He only lasted one semester doing this, and he went on to work as a veteran admin hospital. This was in Coatesville, but he was actually fired for poor attendance and having a rude attitude towards the patients. Now, within the span of the next 25 years, between 62 and 87, Gary has spent a lot of time being admitted to psychiatric units, and he went on to attempt suicide around 13 times. In 1970, Ellen, she had been diagnosed with bone cancer. She was also suffering from alcoholism, and she went on to commit suicide by drinking mercuric chloride. His brother, he was also admitted to a hospital after attempting suicide many times. So obviously he's not having the best of times at this particular point, you can highly imagine, and it's already going to give a frail mind like his even more fragility. Now, in October 71, Gary begins a church service called the United Church of the Ministers of God. And this was just with 5 followers, and he goes on to open a bank account under the church's name with a bank firm called Merrill Lynch. And this is just with a deposit of $1,500. And this eventually amassed to around $500,000. And by 1986, the church was described as prosperous and opulent. Now, in the mid-80s, Gary begins using a marriage service, and he begins talking to a lady called Betty Disto. Betty, originally, she lived in the Philippines. This is where she was born and raised. And not that I like to cast aspersions, but a lot of women in those countries, and men, a lot of people in those countries, they want to seek what they think is a better life for themselves. So here comes a Western man talking to her, giving her some information. She thinks it's a way out of her country for her. So 2 years after talking, Betty actually flies over from the Philippines. This was around September 1985. And by October the 3rd, Gary and Betty were married. But this marriage, it completely deteriorated within a real quick time span. She caught him in bed with 3 other women. He would also force Betty to watch him having sex with other women. Betty said that he had actually raped her on numerous occasions. So, seeking help from the Filipino community, Betty, she was in touch with them. She told them everything that was going on, and they actually helped her escape. And this was by January 1986. On the 15th of September 86, she actually gave birth to their son, Jesse, so she escaped when she was pregnant. And Gary was absolutely unaware of Jesse's existence. And this was not until he began receiving requests for child support payments in 87. And after this, Gary then meets a lady called Gal Linkow. And she gives birth to a son called Gary Jr. Now, immediately after Gary is born, he is taken away and put into foster care. And this breaks up Gary and Gal's relationship, and he goes on to meet another woman called Anjanette Davidson. And Anjanette, she was described as being illiterate, she was mentally disabled, and eventually, within a short time span again, Gary gets Anjanette pregnant. And Anjanette, she gives birth to a little girl called Maxine. And shortly after her birth, Maxine, she is too placed into foster care. So Gary goes out and he thinks it's a good idea, and this is when his dark depravity gets the better of him. And he kidnaps Anjanette's sister, Alberta. And Alberta, she had been admitted to a psychiatric unit in a place called Penn Township. And he held Alberta hostage for a short while and raped her. Now, Gary, he basically turned up on this particular day and signed Alberta out on a day release. He then takes her to a storage room, locks her in there, and this is in his basement. And he rapes her vaginally and anally. And when she was found, she was examined, and she was found to be infected with gonorrhea. Now, Gary was arrested and charged and found guilty of the rape, the false imprisonment, and interfering with the custody of a committed person. And his original sentence was appealed. And I couldn't find any information on what sentence he actually got. What I do know is that he spent the first 3 years in the psychiatric unit, and he was then released under a state-sanctioned mental health program. It was discovered during this time that Gary had been arrested back in 1976 for an aggravated assault and carrying a unlicensed gun after going to a house and shooting the tenant. He shooting the tenant of this house, and he basically went to this house in the false pretenses of renting the house. And luckily for this man, the bullet only grazed his face ever so slightly. Now, after Betty left him in 1986, Gary, he was arrested again and charged with assault, decent assault, spousal rape, and the involuntary deviant sexual intercourse. So obviously what we was talking about earlier, the stuff that he was forcing Betty to do, she said that he raped her, and he was charged with this, which is really good to see. Obviously, spousal rape is incredibly difficult to get a conviction for. We all know that. Now, in November of 1986, Gary then meets a 25-year-old lady called Josephina Rivera, and he kidnaps her, and he takes her back to the basement, locks her in there, and within a short time frame of 2 months, he had kidnapped a further 4 women. So this was Sandra Lindsay, who was 24. He kidnapped her on December the 3rd, 1986. Lisa Thomas, who was 19, on December the 23rd. A lady called Deborah Dudley, also 23. She was kidnapped on January the 22nd, 1987. and Jacqueline Askins, who was 18, and she was kidnapped on January the 18th, 1987. Now, all the women, they were locked into the basement. They were forced to live in a pit. And in turn, each woman was beaten, tortured, and raped over and over and over again. On February the 7th, 1987, after 2 months in this hellhole, 24-year-old Sandra, she died from a combination of starvation, the torture that her body was put under, and she also had a real severe fever. Now, Gary, he pulls her out of the pit and he begins by dismembering her body. He himself spoke out and said that he had real problems dealing with her legs and arms. So he placed them in a freezer and he labelled these boxes as dog food. He then cooked Sandra's ribs in an oven and he boiled her head in a pot. And neighbours, they took notice of this nauseating smell. They called the police and they went to investigate. And Gary just basically lies his way out of this and said that he was cooking a roast dinner and had fallen asleep. So his dinner had burned, and that's what the neighbours were smelling. He also said during the investigation that he had ground up the flesh of Sandra and mixed it with some dog food, and he basically fed this to his victims. But examinations of his kitchen and the utensils found no evidence to back this up. Now, reportedly, one of Gary's favoured torture methods was electrocution. At some point, he forced 3 of his victims into the pit and he ordered 2 other women to fill it with water. He applied electrocution to the wet chains. And one particular day of doing this, 23-year-old Deborah, she dies. And Gary, he just basically pulls her out of the pit and he dumps her body in the Pine Barrens of New Jersey. Now, the youngest of his victims, 18-year-old Jacqueline at the time, she actually spoke out and gave a real rare interview in May 2018. And she described another method for Gary was to wrap their heads with duct tape, and he would actually stab their ears with a screwdriver. And this was just basically so they would have temporary hearing loss, and so they wouldn't be able to hear him coming for them. Which you can imagine is absolutely devastating. You can imagine the pain. Like, it's painful enough when you have a Q-tip or something and you go a little bit too deep. You can imagine having a screwdriver put into your ear. Now, on March the 23rd, 87, Gary goes out with Josephine Rivera, so one of his victims that he's kidnapped. And they together, they kidnap a 24-year-old girl called Agnes Adams. Now, on the next day, Josephina, she encourages Gary to allow Agnes to go see her family. So Gary then drives Agnes to a petrol station. He tells Agnes that he's going to wait there for her, and Agnes, she walks back to her boyfriend's house who lives nearby. Now, soon as she walks in, she tells her boyfriend everything. She tells him where she's been, what's happened to her. And initially, they want to confront Gary, but they realise obviously it's not the best idea because this man is clearly dangerous. So they instead call the police. Now, Agnes is able to give a real good, solid description of Gary. She's able to give a solid description of the car that Gary is driving. And police then arrive and they take her information. They noticed that the chains had chafed Agnes's legs, chafed her wrists. So then they go to the petrol station and they are able to arrest Gary. He's still waiting there for Agnes. And also arrested alongside him was a man called Cyril Brown, who was said to be Gary's best friend. Now, Cyril eventually he was released on a $50,000 bail, and this was also as part of an agreement that he would testify against Gary. Now, Cyril admitted that he witnessed Sandra Lindsay's death, and he saw Gary dismember her body. And whilst he was held on remand, Gary attempted suicide by hanging himself in April of 1987. So he was trying to take the coward's way out. He couldn't face what he had done. He didn't want to face what he had done. He thought by ending his life it would be a lot easier. Thankfully, he doesn't, and he then goes to trial. Now, when it comes to the trial, Gary tried to say that when he moved into the house, the women were already in the basement. So whoever owned the house or lived there previously had picked up these women and left them in the basement, moved out. Now, if that was the case, why weren't the women screaming? Someone would have heard them. So he's just thinking of any feeble way that he can try and get out of this. His defence attorney, Charles Peruto, now he worked real hard to convince the jury that Gary was insane. And however, the prosecutor, a man called Charles Gallagher, he refuted this by stating the fact that Gary had amassed now $550,000 through his accounts and through the church's accounts. And this information, this was what was used to prove that Gary was really astute, and therefore he couldn't be convicted under an insanity law. Robert Kirkpatrick, who was a financial advisor from Merrill Lynch, now he come forward and he said that Gary was an astute investor who basically knew what he was doing. Now, the judge and the jury, they believe everything about this. So they can see for themselves that Gary is making up any random rubbish to try and mitigate his role in this. And eventually he found guilty. On July the 1st of 1988, he's found guilty of 2 counts of murder, 6 counts of kidnap, 5 counts of rape, 4 counts of aggravated assault, and 2 counts of involuntary deviant sexual intercourse. He was then given a sentence of capital punishment, and this was to be by death of lethal injection. And while he was serving his initial time on death row, so people who on death row who are mentally ill, they are allowed to have medication to obviously alleviate any and help deal with their thoughts and feelings. And it was while on serving his time on death row that Gary, he began storing this medication. And by January of 1989, he had took an overdose and attempted suicide for the second time. So again, another way for him to try and take control and not face the consequences of what he has actually done. We then fast forward to 1997, and Gary's daughter Maxine and his ex-wife Betty. Now, Betty had flown back over from the Philippines. She somehow heard about this case, and they filed a suit in which they requested the stay of execution on the basis that Gary wasn't competent enough to be executed. So they're saying that Gary's mental illness should be a factor in him not losing his life, that he should spend the rest of his life in prison for what he's done, but he really shouldn't be executed. Now, this hearing lasted around 2 years. Massive long discussion. am glad that they recognised obviously his mental health. I'm not going to lie, because we all know what it was like in the 90s, with discussions around mental health. But with that being said, the case was then settled in the court's favour, and on July the 3rd, 1999, the court issued its final ruling, and this basically cleared the way for Gary to be executed for his crimes. This came only 2 days later. So on July the 5th, 1999, so over 10 years in death row, Gary was given his permission to have his final meal. And this final meal was the 2 slices of cheese pizza and a black coffee. On July the 6th, next day, he's brought out of his cell for the final time. He's taken down to the room where this is going to be carried out, and they perform the lethal injection, and this obviously slows down his heart rate so he stops beating. And so his final day on earth was July the 6th, 1999. And he was actually the last person to be executed in Pennsylvania, under Pennsylvanian law. And I believe they stopped doing capital punishment in not long after he was executed. Now, Gary's crimes were partly based on the character Buffalo Bill, like I mentioned earlier, and like I mentioned in my TikTok. So this is obviously from The Silence of the Lambs, which obviously started out as a book and went on to become a hugely successful film. And if you haven't seen the film, it's guaranteed, I implore you to go watch it. Incredible film, incredible cast. Tim Levine does an amazing job as Buffalo Bill. So obviously it's only partly based on him. There are some other people that Buffalo Bill was based on, but I wanted to focus on Gary for today. And his crimes were also put into another film, and this film was called Blind Faith, and this was released in 1989. And despite this, I couldn't find any information on this film. It doesn't even have a Wikipedia page, so kind of a difficult one to talk about because I can't find any information on that film anywhere. But it's reported that this was also based on Gary's story and his crimes. Now, I do apologise for it being a much shorter video today. As I said, with last week, I just had an incredibly manic week. I just didn't really have the time. But I wanted to get back onto this, and obviously I'm going to be aiming to go back to my long form videos. So I do really apologise, it's only around the half-hour mark, but I appreciate you guys too much to not put the videos out. So if you just bear with me just while I sort things out, and then we're going to be back on track. So that is all I've got for you today, guys. I really appreciate your time. Please give me a like, share and subscribe. If there's any information that you feel I've missed out, please leave a comment down below. As stated, I can only talk about the stuff that I can find out personally, because I don't have access to court documents and everything. I can only do what I can do. But like I said, if you feel like I missed anything out, then please just leave a comment down below. I always read the comments. If you like this content, please like, share, and if you haven't subscribed yet, please hit that little notification bell. Just want to say thank you to everyone, and I will see you guys very soon for the next true crime story with Silhouette. Please take care, stay safe, and I will see you guys real soon. Bye.